Early morning close quarters combat training. 20 SEAL trainees stood in a circle laughing as Rachel Moore, a petite woman in a faded training outfit with no rank insignia, walked into the corner of the room with an observer badge in hand. Chief Daniels glanced over and scoffed. "Who would you ever fight?" Whistles and taunts echoed across the mat. But just minutes later, when Daniels lunged in to set an example, Rachel pivoted, locked his joint, and stripped the training weapon from his hand in a blur, leaving the entire room in stunned silence. The day before, Rachel had sat alone in a diner just outside the base, her coffee going cold as she stared at an old photo tucked in her wallet. It showed a younger, her barely 18, standing next to her father, in his dress blues, his arm around her shoulders. He'd been her whole world back then, teaching her discipline, focus how to move through a room without drawing attention. He'd also taught her how to fight, not just with fists, but with silence, with presence. That photo was all she had left of him now. The last time they had spoken, he had warned her about places like this, where people judged what they couldn't understand. She had promised to keep her head down. But as she folded the photo away, her jaw tightened. Promises were hard to keep when people pushed too far. The diner's radio had been playing some old country song, and the waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, had refilled Rachel's cup without asking. Rachel thanked her, her voice soft but steady, and left a tip that was more than the meal. She didn't need to flash money to feel worth something, but she knew what it was like to be overlooked. That waitress had looked at her like she was just another drifter, maybe a broke college kid in her plain jeans and faded jacket. Rachel didn't correct her. She never did. She just paid, picked up her bag, and walked out into the dusk, the weight of the next day already settling on her shoulders. As Rachel stepped into the training room, a trainee with a slicked-back ponytail and a gold chain around his neck leaned against a wall, his smirk sharp as a blade. He nudged the guy next to him, his voice carrying just enough to reach her. "What's she doing here?" Lost her way to the typing pool. The room chuckled, the sound rolling like a wave. Rachel's fingers tightened on her clipboard, but her face stayed still, her eyes flicking to the trainee for just a moment before returning to the mat. She adjusted her badge, pinning it straighter, her movements precise, like she was steadying herself for something bigger than their words. The cold white light from the overhead lamps made the sparring mat look sterile, like a stage set for judgment. Rachel held her clipboard close, her fingers steady, but her eyes caught every detail, the way the trainees leaned toward each other, whispering, the way their laughter carried that edge of cruelty. Chief Daniels, tall and broad, his voice like gravel, stood in the center, demonstrating a hold to the group. He hadn't even looked at her when she walked in, but when he did, his smirk said it all. "Who would you ever fight?" he'd said, and the room had erupted. One trainee, a guy with a buzz cut and a cocky grin, added, "Looks like she's never thrown a punch in her life." Rachel just nodded a small, almost invisible gesture and leaned against the wall, her badge pinned loosely to her jacket. "Hey, if you're watching this, take a second, grab your phone, hit that like button, leave a comment below about what this moment feels like to you. And if you want to hear the rest of Rachel's story, subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to share this journey with you." The session started and the trainees paired off their boots, scuffing the mat as they practiced locks and throws. Daniels moved among them, barking corrections, his presence filling the room. Rachel stayed quiet, her pen scratching notes on the clipboard, but her eyes never stopped moving. She saw the way one trainee, a lanky guy with a loud laugh, kept glancing her way like he was waiting for her to flinch. Another, a stocky kid with a fresh tattoo on his forearm, muttered something to his partner, and they both snickered, their eyes darting to her faded outfit. She didn't react. She just kept writing her handwriting, neat, her face calm. But her shoulders were squared, her weight balanced on the balls of her feet like she was ready to move at any second. One trainee, a wiry guy with a chipped tooth and a restless energy, tossed his water bottle to the floor near Rachel's feet, letting it roll just close enough to graze her shoe. "Oops," he said, his grin wide, daring her to pick it up. The others watched, waiting for her to bend to show weakness. Rachel didn't move. She glanced at the bottle, then at him, her eyes steady, unblinking. "You dropped something," she said, her voice low, each word deliberate. The guy's grin faltered just for a second before he scooped up the bottle, muttering under his breath. The room shifted, a ripple of unease passing through the trainees like they had misjudged their target. Lieutenant Parker sat in the command row, his sharp eyes taking in the whole scene. He was older, quieter than Daniels, with a face that looked like it had seen too many long nights. His pen hovered over his notebook, And when he glanced at Rachel, he noticed something the others didn't. She wasn't just standing there. Her stance was deliberate, her knees slightly bent, her body angled just enough to react. He drew a small question mark in the margin of his notes, his lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't say anything, didn't call attention to her, but he watched his gaze steady, like he was piecing something together. A trainee with a hoarse voice and a faded scar across his knuckles leaned toward his partner, his words sharp and meant to carry. Bet she's just here to fill a quota. Diversity hire, right? The room snickered the sound low and mean like a pack circling. Rachel's pen paused for a fraction of a second, her fingers tightening briefly on the clipboard. She tilted her head just enough to catch the trainee's eye and held his gaze until he looked away, his scar seeming to darken under the fluorescent lights. She resumed writing, her stroke steady, but the air around her felt charged like she'd marked him without saying a word. Daniels finished his demonstration showing a wrist lock that made one trainee wince. The room clapped, a few guys whooping like they were at a game. Then Daniels turned, his eyes landing on Rachel. "Want to try?" he said, his voice loud enough to carry. The trainees burst out laughing, some doubling over others, slapping each other's backs. Rachel looked up, her expression unchanged. "I'm not here to fight," she said softly, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Daniels stepped closer, his boots heavy on the mat. "Because you know you'd lose," he said, his grin wide, daring her to argue. The lanky trainee shouted, "Let her try, it'll be fun." The room roared again, the sound pressing in on her. As the laughter died down, a trainee with a shaved head and a scar above his eyebrow stepped forward, his voice dripping with fake concern. "You sure you're in the right place, sweetheart? This ain't yoga class." He spread his arms, inviting the room to join in, and they did, their chuckles sharp and mean. Rachel's fingers paused on her clipboard, her pen hovering mid-stroke. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "You done?" she asked, her tone so calm it felt like a challenge. The trainee's arms dropped, his smirk fading as he shuffled back, the room's energy shifting under the weight of her quiet defiance. Rachel sighed, a small sound that nobody seemed to notice. She set her clipboard on a chair, her movement slow and deliberate. She slipped off her jacket, revealing a faded short-sleeved training shirt that hung loosely on her frame. The room quieted for a split second, like they were waiting for her to back out. She stepped to the center of the mat, her eyes sweeping the circle of trainees, noting their positions, the way they stood, the way they breathed. Parker leaned forward slightly, his pen still in his hand. Daniels cracked his knuckles, his smile confident, almost lazy. "All right, let's make this quick," he said, motioning for the bout to start. Before Daniels could move, a trainee with a loud voice and a flashy watch leaned in, his tone mocking. "Careful, Chief, don't break her. She looks like she might cry." The room erupted again, the laughter louder, crueler. Rachel's hands rested lightly at her sides, but her fingers twitched just once, like she was measuring the distance between her and the trainee. She didn't speak, didn't look at him. Instead, she adjusted her stance, her feet finding the mat's center, her body loose but ready. The trainee's laugh faded when he met her eyes, something in her gaze making him step back, his watch glinting under the harsh lights. Daniels circled her, his steps light for a man his size. He was playing it up, pretending to look for an opening, his arms loose at his sides. 3 seconds and you'll be down," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few trainees stomped their boots, the rhythm building like a drum roll. Rachel didn't move, didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on Daniels, her body still but ready. The room was alive with tension, the kind that comes when people think they're about to see someone break. Nobody thought she could hold her own, not against a SEAL instructor, not against a man who'd spent years mastering close-quarters combat. Halfway through the circling, a trainee with a buzz cut and a smug grin tossed a spare glove toward Rachel, letting it skid across the mat to her feet. "Put that on, kid. You'll need it." The room snickered, the sound, sharp like a whip. Rachel glanced down at the glove, then back at the trainee, her expression blank, but her eyes piercing. She nudged the glove aside with her foot, her movement slow, deliberate, like she was dismissing more than just the glove. "I'm good," she said, her voice so quiet it forced the room to lean in to hear. The trainee's grin froze his confidence, cracking as the others shifted uncomfortably. Then Daniels lunged, his hand shooting out to grab her shoulder. In a blink, Rachel pivoted, her body flowing like water. She caught his wrist, twisted it just enough to lock the joint, and used his own momentum to drop him to the mat. It wasn't violent, wasn't showy. She did it clean, gentle, almost like she was setting down a glass. Daniels hit the mat with a soft thud, his eyes wide as he stared up at her. The training weapon on his belt was already in her hand, held loosely at her side. The room went dead silent, the kind of quiet that feels like the air's been sucked out. Daniels pushed himself up, his face flushed, his jaw tight. A trainee with a thick neck and a sneering tone leaned forward, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. Beginner's luck. She probably just got a good angle. His words were meant to rally the room, to pull them back to their mocking confidence. Rachel didn't look at him. She twirled the training weapon in her hand just once, the motion so casual it felt like a signature. The room's energy shifted again, the trainee's eyes narrowing as they watched her fingers move with a precision that didn't belong to a beginner. She set the weapon down on the mat, her movements slow, like she was giving them time to catch up to what they'd just seen. The lanky trainee broke the silence. "Just lucky," he said, crossing his arms. "Do it again." Daniels stood brushing off his pants, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This time serious," he said, his voice lower now, like he was trying to convince himself. The trainees crowded closer, forming a tighter circle around the mat. Rachel nodded just once, her face still calm. "Your call," she said, her voice soft but steady, like she was agreeing to a coffee order. The air felt heavier now, the laughter gone, replaced by something else. Curiosity, maybe, or doubt. As Daniels prepared to attack again, a trainee with a deep voice and a crew cut leaned over to his buddy loud enough for everyone to hear. "Bet she's just some admin who watched a YouTube tutorial." The room chuckled, but it was nervous now, less certain. Rachel's eyes flicked to him just for a moment, and she tilted her head slightly like she was filing the comment away. She adjusted her footing, her hands loose, her gaze back on Daniels. The trainee's buddy nudged him, whispering something, but the crew cut guy just shrugged his bravado, faltering under her steady stare. Daniels didn't waste time. He came at her faster, throwing a straight punch aimed at her shoulder. Rachel sidestepped, her movements so smooth they looked effortless. She caught his wrist, rotated it just enough to make him wince, and used his forward motion to throw him aside. Before he could recover, she plucked the training weapon from his belt again, holding it up for a split second before tossing it lightly to the mat. The room froze. Parker let out a quiet chuckle, his eyes bright with something like recognition. That disarm, it wasn't just skill. It was the kind of move you only saw in certain circles, the kind that came from training most people never got close to. A trainee with a loud laugh and a crooked nose stepped forward, his hands on his hips. He said, his tone half joking, half accusing, like he couldn't decide if he was impressed or insulted. The room waited, eyes darting between him and Rachel. She didn't answer, just bent to pick up her clipboard, her movements slow, almost ceremonial. As she straightened, she looked at him, her eyes calm but sharp enough to make him shift his weight. "You talk a lot," she said, her voice so soft it barely carried, but it hit like a dart. The trainee's laugh died in his throat, and he looked away, his hands dropping to his sides. The stocky trainee with the tattoos stepped forward, his face red. "Who are you really?" he demanded, his voice loud but shaky. Rachel didn't answer right away. She walked back to the chair, picked up her clipboard, and slipped her jacket back on, her movements slow and precise. The room buzzed, trainees whispering to each other, their eyes darting between her and Daniels. Daniels stood there, his arms crossed, his face a mix of shock and something else. Maybe respect, maybe anger. Rachel just smiled a small private smile and turned to leave her boots quiet on the mat. As she reached the door, a trainee with a goatee and a nervous energy called out, "Hey, you can't just walk away like that." His voice cracked, betraying his unease. Rachel paused, her hand on the doorframe, and glanced back, her eyes sweeping the room one last time. "I just did," she said, her tone flat final. The words hung in the air, and the trainees exchanged glances, their bravado crumbling. She pushed the door open, the hinges creaking softly, and stepped into the hallway, leaving the room to grapple with the weight of her absence. Parker stood up, then his chair scraping softly against the floor. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a red envelope, the word classified stamped across it in bold letters. He handed it to Daniels without a word. Daniels opened it, his hands moving slowly like he wasn't sure he wanted to see what was inside. The first page was a personnel file, and at the top in clear print, Rachel Moore, Instructor, CQC Specialist. Call sign, The Ghost. Daniels looked up, his mouth half open, but Rachel was already gone. On the table next to her clipboard, she'd left her observer badge and a handwritten note, "Old habits die hard." The room didn't stay quiet for long. The trainees started talking, their voices low, urgent, trying to make sense of what they'd just seen. One of them, the lanky guy who'd called her lucky, pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he typed. By that afternoon, a clip of the bout was online posted on a military forum with the caption, "Unknown woman humiliates SEAL instructor." It spread fast, racking up views, comments piling up, some calling it fake, others demanding to know who she was. The stocky trainee with the tattoo didn't show up to training the next day. Word got around that he had been dropped from the program, his attitude flagged as a liability after the incident. Later that evening in the base's mess hall, the trainee with the gold chain sat alone, his tray untouched. He'd been the first to mock Rachel, and now his buddies avoided his table, their whispers sharp as they glanced his way. He scrolled through his phone, his face pale as he read a message from his sponsor, a tactical gear brand informing him his contract was terminated, effective immediately. He set the phone down, his hands trembling, and stared at the empty seat across from him, like he could still see Rachel's calm gaze cutting through his bravado. Daniels didn't talk much after that day either. He kept running sessions, but his voice wasn't as loud, his steps not as sure. A week later, a memo went out. He'd been reassigned to a desk job, his role as lead instructor quietly handed to someone else. Nobody said it was because of Rachel, but the timing wasn't hard to read. The lanky trainee's post got taken down. After a few days, his account suspended for violating some vague community guideline. Whispers started circling that he'd lost a sponsorship deal with a tactical gear company, his name scrubbed from their ambassador list overnight. The trainee with the chipped tooth, who'd tossed the water bottle, found himself called into the commander's office a few days later. He stood at attention, sweat beading on his forehead as the commander flipped through his file. "Disrespect doesn't belong here," the commander said, his voice low, final. The trainee was given a choice, a formal reprimand, or a transfer to a logistics unit. He chose the transfer, his head down as he packed his gear, his dreams of SEAL glory fading with every step he took away from the mat. Rachel didn't stick around to see any of it. She was back on the road by the next morning, her old pickup truck rattling down the highway. She stopped at a gas station, the same one she'd passed on her way to the base. The clerk, a guy with a faded ball cap, glanced at her plain clothes and asked if she was heading somewhere special. She just smiled, paid for her coffee, and said, "Just passing through." Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from her husband. "Done already." It read. She typed back, "Yeah, old habits." She didn't need to say more. He'd know what she meant. Years ago, Rachel had been a kid trailing her father through bases like this one. She'd watch him spar his movements, sharp, precise, like a language she wanted to learn. One day when she was 12, he had caught her mimicking his footwork in the backyard. He didn't laugh, didn't tell her to stop. He just nodded and said, "Keep your elbows in." By the time she was 16, she was holding her own against men twice her size. Her father's voice in her ear, "Don't fight to win. Fight to walk away." She'd carried that with her through every training session, every mission, every room where people looked at her and saw less than she was. At a roadside diner the next day, Rachel sat in a corner booth, her bag on the seat beside her. A couple of locals, rough-looking guys in work boots, glanced her way, one muttering something about her ratty jacket. She didn't look up from her coffee, but her fingers traced the edge of the photo in her pocket, her father's face flashing in her mind. One of the guys laughed loud enough to draw eyes, but Rachel just sipped her drink, her movements slow, deliberate. The waitress, the same one from before, caught her eye and gave a small nod like she understood something nobody else did. Rachel left another big tip and walked out, the locals' laughter fading behind her. Back at the base, a trainee with a buzzed head and a nervous tick in his jaw found a crumpled piece of paper near the mat, half hidden under a bench. It was a training schedule marked with Rachel's initials in the corner, listing sessions she'd led years ago for an elite unit. He showed it to the quiet trainee who'd stayed silent during the session, and they exchanged a look, the paper trembling in his hand. He didn't share it with the others, but he kept it, tucking it into his locker, like a secret that could change how he saw the world. The trainees kept talking about her, their voices quieter now, like they were afraid she might hear. One of them, a younger guy who'd stayed silent during the session, found her note on the table later that day. He read it, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his pocket. He didn't tell anyone, but he started training harder, his focus sharper, like he was chasing something he couldn't name. Parker, too, kept her file close, reading it late at night, the pages worn from being turned. He'd seen a lot in his years, but Rachel, her calm, her precision, her silence stayed with him. The truth about Rachel came out slowly in pieces. A name dropped in a briefing, A quiet nod from an officer who'd worked with her years ago. Then one day a senior commander walked into the training room, his presence enough to make everyone stand straighter. He didn't say much, just asked about the session about the observer who'd been there. When someone mentioned her name, he paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. Moore, he said, like it was a name that carried weight. Nobody asked more. They didn't need to. The commander was her husband. He didn't wear a ring, didn't talk about his personal life. But when he walked into that room, the air shifted. The lanky trainee who had been trying to joke about the whole thing went quiet, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Daniels, who'd been reassigned but was there for a meeting, looked away, his jaw tight. Another trainee, the one with the flashy watch, tried to recover, offering a weak smile and, "Good to see you, sir." The commander didn't respond, his eyes scanning the room, landing on the spot where Rachel had stood. She was still by the door, her bag slung over her shoulder, her face calm, but her presence undeniable. The trainee with the scar above his eyebrow, who'd called her sweetheart, shifted uncomfortably, his boots scuffing the floor. He'd posted about the incident on a private group chat, boasting about how he'd put her in her place. That chat was leaked by the next morning, his words screenshotted and shared across the base. By the end of the week, he was out of the program, his name quietly removed from the roster, his bravado reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in the barracks. The fallout came fast, but it wasn't loud. It was the kind of quiet justice that doesn't need a spotlight. The lanky trainee's online bravado cost him more than he had expected, his name blacklisted from every major training program in the region. The stocky guy with the tattoo tried to spin the story at a bar a few weeks later, but nobody listened. His reputation was done, his social media accounts bleeding followers by the day. Daniels kept his head down, pushing papers in an office that smelled like stale coffee, his days of leading men on the mat long gone. Life didn't shout its consequences. It just delivered them. Rachel didn't look back. She drove on her truck, kicking up dust on back roads, her eyes on the horizon. She didn't need their apologies, their shock, their whispers. Her silence was her strength, her presence, her proof. She'd walked into that room a stranger and left it a legend. And somewhere in the quiet of her own heart, she carried her father's voice, his lessons, his pride. She'd fought not to win, but to walk away. And she had, for everyone watching, everyone who's ever been looked down on, counted out, or told, "You don't belong. This one's for you." You know, that ache, that sting of being unseen. You weren't wrong to feel it. You weren't alone in carrying it. And you're still here, still standing, still walking forward. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.